The psychiatric system is built on misinformation disseminated by the authorities. The authorities fundamentally misinformed the population by insisting that mental illness is caused by chemical imbalances. It is not supported by the best research in the field, but is continued because doctors and psychiatrists sit heavily on psychiatry. The harmful effects of psychotropic drugs are extensive and can be dangerous. In an ideal world, the best science would lead to the best practice. Practice would justify future research, and both parts would, as a basis for political decision-making, push societal development in the most appropriate direction. But that's not what we see. In the lead-up to the general election, you could often read that psychiatry is starving. It is written about historically great support for and historical agreement about the need to lift psychiatry. And many youth organizations also support the 10-year plan. There has never been as much talk about psychiatry as there is now. And that should be a good thing, right? Bad definitions. The problem is what we would actually call misinformation. We believe that psychiatry as a system fundamentally misinforms the population about mental illness. This misinformation is perpetuated in textbooks in psychiatry, and therefore many psychiatric practitioners end up misinforming their patients. The misinformation stems from psychiatry's view of what it means to suffer mentally, according to what we call the disease-centered model, which is the basis of psychiatry's practice and research. Mental suffering develops into illness when we suffer enough. In this psychiatric model, enough suffering means that one scores sufficiently high on a number of symptoms. But for all psychiatric diagnoses, symptoms are only snapshots of thoughts, feelings, and behavior. There is not a single psychiatric diagnosis that we can scan our way to, measure in blood, or signaling substances, or otherwise register with classic medical examinations. System-believing psychiatrists will often object that there is research that points to brain abnormalities, chemical imbalances in the brain and the like. The problem is that what the researchers point to on the basis of the last 40 years of research, scientifically speaking, is nothing more than untenable vague indications. They are indeed rooted in the diagnostic classification systems DSM-3 and ICD-1, which precisely define psychiatric disorders as a collection of symptoms, and which have been scientifically problematic since their conception, and still are. And because, as mentioned before, the symptoms are snapshots, the definitions are therefore also unclear and fluid. Psychiatric research is not irrelevant, but research guided by diagnoses that are poorly and vaguely defined logically leads to bad or vague research. The authorities misinform. The misinformation consists in the fact that the authorities in their announcements to the public claim that some diagnoses are caused by a chemical imbalance, even though the sum of science in the field does not support this hypothesis. On sun.dk, which is run by the regions, municipalities, and the Ministry of Health, you can, for example, read about a chemical imbalance that is found in most cases of depression. It is a problem that the publicly available and apparently reliable information about mental disorders picks sides in a scientific debate that is not settled and where evidence for decisive claims is lacking. As an extension of this, psychotropic drugs are uncritically prompted as medicine against illness. But psychopharmaceuticals that affect imbalances and brain abnormalities cannot be said to be medicines against disease, as long as we cannot point to imbalances or brain abnormalities as the cause of the disorder. In order to determine whether the preparations are beneficial, we must instead compare all their effects, harmful as well as effective, and take stock of the effect on the sufferer. And here psychopharmaceuticals are generally not convincingly effective compared to placebo in efficacy studies. In contrast, the harmful effects of psychotropic drugs are extensive and can be dangerous. In the best case, the preparations must therefore be regarded as relieving agents. Chemical sedation may well make sense if a suffering person is out of contact or a danger to himself or others. But this is far from how the preparations are presented to the sufferers and to the population, and that is a problem. The doctors take care of the crazy. We cannot therefore register the psychiatric diagnoses using classic medical examinations. The diagnoses are scientifically unreliable and poorly defined, and the purpose of the psychiatric interventions is per definition symptom reduction, which at the same time entails a risk of significant adverse effects. Well, then why do we have a medically led psychiatry that mainly works from a biological disease model? Primarily because historically it was doctors who took care of the insane. But that is no longer reason enough to retain a monodisciplinary approach. It is a democratic problem that it is so difficult to get this debate going. The authors of this chronicle have tried for years to draw attention to the fundamental problems, but we are usually met with a blank rejection from the top of psychiatry or with political shrugs. But the debate about psychiatry is so much more than a professional battle. It is a fight for vital systems in society to be based on the best science, not on the desire of one profession to retain power and the right to define. Theoretical and practical research shows that we can do much better, and this becomes clear when you look at statistics on psychiatry as it is right now. Almost 700,000 Danes are on psychotropic drugs. 71% of adults with psychiatric diagnosis are out of work, and 50% of those who were in work when they were hospitalized are not in work 6 months after psychiatric hospitalization. Danish psychiatry uses far too much coercion, for which we have been criticized by the UN. At the same time, it is so unattractive to be a psychiatrist in psychiatry that the municipalities have to pay millions of public krona to the temp agencies where the psychiatrists find work instead. What conclusion can be drawn from this? A new and better system. The obvious conclusion is that the psychiatric system in Denmark rests on a hollow and misinformed foundation. This justifies a growing desire, both among psychologists and critical psychiatrists, to develop and test an approach that is not based on a biological or disease-centered model. A system which does not see mental suffering as a state of deficiency, but rather predominantly as meaningful, understandable human reactions to the lives people live. Such approaches are represented, among other things, by open dialogue, the voice listener network, the trauma-informed approach and the power-threat meaning framework model. Experiences from, for example, the open dialogue approach in its original Finnish form and from trauma-informed approaches support that a better founded system does not need to be more expensive than equivalent psychiatry. At the same time, it is relevant to ask ourselves how long we can afford to keep an ill-founded system that has given Denmark the dubious honor of being the OECD country with the most early retirements due to psychiatric diagnosis, and how reintegration into society and on the labor market all too rarely succeed. In the transition to a context-based system, we would also cut the problematic ties to the pharmaceutical industry once and for all. We must develop a good Danish model for better, completely different psychiatry. And shouldn't psychiatrists really welcome the development of a well-founded systemic alternative, given how poorly the disease-centered approach has performed? What do you risk? That we are right. Jonas Sven-Erik Ditlevsen is an independent psychologist and debater. Peter C. Gotzsche is Professor Emeritus and Director. Marianne Lassen is a teacher. Linda Coulson is a relational trauma therapist. Birgit Simura-Toft is a Ph.D. and consulting pharmacist. Anders Sorensen is a Ph.D. and psychologist. Annette Jacobsen is a psychologist and specialist in psychotherapy. Olga Runciman is an independent psychologist. Herlaf Dalhoff is a retired general practitioner. Helen Sholm is a nurse.